I had been driving for nearly 6 hours, my fingers gripping the steering wheel as I tried to keep my eyes focused on the endless stretch of highway ahead. The road was mostly empty, save for the occasional 18-wheeler roaring past, its headlights cutting through the dense fog that had begun to roll in. I was heading to a cabin deep in the woods, a secluded rental I had found online, meant to give me a break from the endless grind of my daily life. The idea was simple: a weekend of solitude, no phone, no emails, just me, nature, and some peace and quiet. But as the highway stretched on, the unease in my gut grew. I should have left earlier. The sun had long since disappeared, swallowed by a starless sky. The fog thickened as I turned onto the last stretch of road before reaching my destination. It was a narrow, winding route, lined with towering pine trees on either side. That was when I saw him. A figure stood motionless on the shoulder of the road, just at the edge of my headlight's reach. He was tall, dressed in dark clothing, and facing the trees with his back toward me. My stomach twisted as I slowed slightly, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. As I passed him, something compelled me to glance in the rearview mirror. He was facing me now. I let out a sharp breath and shook my head. I was exhausted, that was all. My mind was playing tricks on me. 15 minutes later, the road grew more desolate. There was no cell service, no street lights, just my high beams illuminating the foggy path ahead. Then, just as I rounded a bend, my breath caught in my throat. There he was again, standing on the side of the road in the exact same position. I felt my pulse pound in my ears. There was no way he could have gotten here before me. No other cars had passed by. No hidden roads. It wasn't possible. I pressed my foot harder on the gas, my heart racing. The sign for the rental cabin was only a few miles ahead. I just needed to get there, lock the door, and get some sleep. Then, the worst possible thing happened. The car shuddered violently, a loud pop echoing through the night. My dashboard lit up with a low-pressure warning. A flat tire. I slowed to a stop, pulling onto the shoulder. My hands were trembling as I reached for my phone, but as expected, there was no service. I needed to change the tire. Taking a deep breath, I reached for the flashlight in my glove compartment. Stepping outside, the cold air wrapped around me like icy fingers. I shone the light toward the rear tire. It was completely deflated. I crouched down, fumbling with the jack, when I heard it. Footsteps. Not from the road. From the trees. I shot up, my flashlight shaking as I aimed it toward the darkened woods. The sound stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the kind so thick it pressed against my ears. I forced myself to breathe. It's just an animal. Just a deer. I turned back to my work, my fingers stiff from the cold. Then, a whisper. Right behind me. You need help. I spun around so fast I nearly fell. The flashlight beam caught him, the same man from the road. He was standing just beyond the reach of my headlights, half in the shadows. My throat closed. I tried to speak, but the words died before they could leave my lips. He tilted his head slightly. His face was expressionless, his dark eyes locked onto mine. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, without another word, he turned and walked, melted, back into the trees, vanishing into the thick fog. I didn't care about the tire anymore. I threw my tools into the back seat, slammed the door shut, and hit the gas, forcing the car forward even as the rim scraped against the asphalt. I just needed to get out of there. As I sped forward, I chanced one final glance in the rearview mirror. He was standing in the middle of the road, watching me. And then, he smiled. The moment I saw that smile in my rearview mirror, my entire body went cold. It wasn't a normal smile, it was unnatural, stretched too wide, like his skin barely contained it. I didn't slow down. I didn't blink. My car groaned from the damaged tire as I sped along the twisting road, my heart hammering against my ribs. The rental cabin had to be close. I checked my phone again. No signal. Then, just as I made another turn, I saw the faint glow of a porch light through the trees. Relief hit me like a wave. The cabin. I yanked the steering wheel, pulling into the narrow gravel driveway, my hands slick with sweat. The place was small, a single-story wooden structure with a wraparound porch. The windows were dark, except for the porch light buzzing weakly above the front door. I parked haphazardly, not even bothering to straighten out, and practically threw myself out of the car. My boots crunched against the gravel as I ran up the steps and fumbled with the keys I had picked up earlier from a lockbox. The second I got the door open, I slammed it behind me and locked it. Silence. Only my ragged breaths filled the space. The cabin smelled like old wood and dust. A small fireplace sat unlit in the corner. There was a couch, a tiny kitchen, and a hallway leading to a single bedroom. Everything was exactly how it had looked in the listing. I pressed my forehead against the door, eyes shut tight, trying to steady myself. Then my heart stopped. Somewhere behind me, inside the cabin, the floor creaked. I spun around so fast I nearly tripped. My flashlight's beam darted across the room. Searching, nothing. The sound had come from the hallway. I swallowed hard. I had locked the door. There was no other way in. No sign of forced entry. Then, my flashlight flickered. The bulb stuttered once. Twice. Then, as if something had sucked the power straight out of it, it died. The cabin was plunged into complete darkness. My breath hitched in my throat. I twisted the flashlight's top, smacking it against my palm. Come on. Come on. Another creak. Closer. I backed up, my heel hitting the front door. A whisper. Low. Raspy. Right next to my ear. You shouldn't have come. I screamed, lunging for the nearest light switch. The room flooded with dim yellow light. And there was nothing. No one. I was alone. But I wasn't convinced. My pulse pounded in my ears as I moved toward the hallway, inch by inch. I reached the bedroom door, heart slamming against my ribs. It was slightly ajar. I lifted a shaking hand and pushed it open. The bed was made. The curtains drawn. Then I saw it. On the nightstand. A photograph. It wasn't mine. The edges were frayed, the colors slightly faded. I reached for it with numb fingers, lifting it toward the dim light. The picture showed the cabin. The same room. The same bed. And someone was lying in it. A man. A man wearing the exact same clothes as the one on the road. My stomach turned to stone. The door creaked behind me. I spun around. He was there, standing in the doorway, his head slightly tilted, that smile stretching across his face. But this time, his eyes weren't just locked onto me. They were mine. Not similar. Not a resemblance. They were identical to my own. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. He took a single step forward. I stumbled back, my legs hitting the bed. My vision blurred. The room seemed to tilt. A whisper. I've been waiting. The world snapped to black. The next morning, I jolted awake to the sound of knocking. Sunlight streamed through the window. My heart felt like it was trying to escape my chest. I was lying in the bed. The same bed. I didn't remember getting here. A sharp knock again. I forced myself up, staggering toward the front door. When I opened it, a man stood there. A park ranger. Morning, he said, eyeing me carefully. Sorry to bother you, but we had a report of a car abandoned in the middle of the road last night. The tire was blown out. My mouth went dry. That's my car. His brow furrowed. You walked here. I tried to speak, but my throat felt too tight. He studied me for a moment, then exhaled, shaking his head. Listen, I don't know if you knew, but this cabin's been empty for years. It's not supposed to be rented out. Some guy tried to stay here a few years back. Never left. They found his car, but not him. Some folks say they still see him wandering the road at night. I couldn't respond. Couldn't speak. I turned my head slightly. Through the reflection in the window, I saw him, standing right behind me, smiling. Story 2. It was just past midnight when I pulled into the gas station. The road had been long, winding through miles of unbroken forest, with no other cars in sight for what felt like hours. I had taken this route to avoid heavy traffic, but now, alone in the dim glow of my headlights, I was beginning to regret it. The gas station itself was run down, its flickering neon sign barely illuminating the cracked pavement of the lot. The only other vehicle was an old, rusted pickup truck parked by the pump furthest from the entrance. A man stood beside it, hood up, filling his tank. He was wearing a heavy flannel jacket, his face obscured by the dim lighting. I stepped out of my car, the cold night air biting at my skin. The silence felt wrong, like the whole world had been muffled. Inside, the cashier barely looked up as I grabbed a coffee and paid for my gas. I caught sight of myself in the convex security mirror above the counter. I looked exhausted, my eyes dark and sunken from the long drive. As I stepped back outside, the man at the pump was still there, standing completely still now, just watching me. I hesitated. He hadn't even finished pumping his gas. His truck looked ancient, the kind that shouldn't still be on the road. I quickened my pace back to my car, trying not to look at him. As soon as I got in, I locked the doors and started the engine. As I pulled away, I checked my rearview mirror. The man was still standing there, still watching. Then, I saw something that made my stomach drop. His truck wasn't running. There was no steam from the exhaust, no sound of an idling engine. but I had just watched him standing there, pretending to pump gas. I turned onto the empty highway, gripping the wheel tight. I needed to get out of here. A few minutes passed, my pulse slowly steadying. Then, a warning chime from my dashboard. Low tire pressure. I frowned. That was odd. I hadn't hit anything. The car still felt fine, but the warning wouldn't go away. I debated stopping, but I didn't want to pull over on a dark, isolated road, not after what just happened. I decided to keep driving until I reached a more populated area. Then, in my side mirror, something caught my eye. Headlights. A truck's headlights. I swallowed hard. It was keeping its distance, but it was definitely following me. I tapped my brakes slightly, just to see what would happen. The truck slowed down too. It was him. I was sure of it. I pressed harder on the gas, watching as the speedometer climbed. The truck kept pace, never getting too close, never backing off. Then, suddenly a pop. The car jerked violently to the side. The steering wheel wrenched in my hands as I fought to keep control. I managed to pull onto the shoulder, heart pounding as I tried to catch my breath. I stepped out, my hands trembling as I circled to check the damage. The rear tire was completely shredded, bits of rubber littering the pavement. I didn't hear him approach. "You need a hand?" The voice was calm, almost friendly. I turned so fast I nearly tripped. He was standing just a few feet away, silhouetted by his truck's headlights. I hadn't heard him pull over. Hadn't heard a single sound. My pulse roared in my ears. I'm good," I forced out, taking a step back toward my car. He smiled. "You sure? Looks like a bad blowout." I tried to swallow my fear, tried to act normal. "Yeah, I've got roadside assistance coming." His smile didn't waver. "No service out here, though." "How'd you call?" I froze. I hadn't called yet. I forced a chuckle. Preloaded the request earlier. His head tilted slightly. Then he nodded, taking a step back. "All right then. Hope you get it sorted out." With that, he turned and walked back to his truck. I waited, barely breathing, as he climbed inside. I watched his taillights disappear down the road, waiting until I was sure he was gone. Then I scrambled into my car and locked the doors, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. No signal. I gritted my teeth. I just needed to put the spare on and get out of here. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, moving as quickly as I could to get the tools from my trunk. My fingers fumbled with the jack, trying to fit it into place. Then, a voice. But not from behind me. Not from the road. From the woods. "Hey, over here." I stiffened, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was his, but his truck had driven away. I had watched it leave. Slowly, I turned my flashlight toward the trees. And there, just beyond the tree line, he stood, smiling. My fingers turned to ice around the flashlight as I stared into the dark woods. He was standing just inside the tree line, his body barely visible in the tangle of branches and shadows. The beam of my flashlight caught his face, still, calm, smiling. But my stomach twisted. How was this possible? I had watched him drive away. I had seen the taillights disappear down the road. There was no way he could have circled back so quickly and ended up in the woods without making a sound. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My legs screamed at me to move, to run back to my car and lock myself inside. But I couldn't, because something else was wrong. Something I almost didn't notice. The man in the woods, the one watching me, was wearing the same clothes as the guy from the gas station. The same flannel jacket, the same heavy boots. But his face was different. Not entirely, not drastically, but enough that my brain stuttered over the details. His features were just a little off. The eyes were a shade too dark, the nose a bit too narrow, the smile stretched a fraction too wide. It was him, but it wasn't. The man shifted, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. His boots crunched on the frost-covered leaves, the sound cutting through the thick silence of the woods. I took a step back, bumping against my car. My voice came out hoarse, barely a whisper. I swallowed and tried again. "Who are you?" His head tilted, the motion so unnatural it made my stomach clench. "You need some help?" It was the exact same words, the exact same tone as before. Like a recording. I shook my head, my heartbeat slamming against my ribs. Then, another sound. A low rumble in the distance. A flash of headlights rounding the bend in the road. A truck. My breath caught. I turned toward the road, my mind racing. It was his truck. The same old, rusted pickup. It was coming back. The engine growled as it slowed, the headlights bouncing off the trees. I felt my knees lock, my muscles frozen between two impossible realities. Behind me, in the woods, the man's smile widened. Then, he stepped backward. Not turned, not ran. Just walked backward into the trees, vanishing into the darkness. I spun around, my breath coming in sharp bursts as the truck rolled to a stop beside my car. The driver's side door creaked open, and the same man stepped out. My body turned to stone. Same flannel jacket, same heavy boots, same slow, deliberate movements. But it was him. The face I had seen at the gas station. The one I had spoken to just minutes ago. Not the man in the woods. The blood in my veins turned to ice as he looked at me, his face unreadable. "You're still here," he said. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. He took a step forward, glancing at my shredded tire, then back at me. "Told you I could help." My mind screamed run, but my body refused to obey. Because if this was the real man, then what the hell had I just seen in the woods? You drove away?" I stammered. His expression didn't change. "Did I?" I swallowed hard. "I saw you leave." A flicker of something crossed his face, like amusement. He took another step closer, and that was when I saw it. The mud on his boots. It wasn't the same color as the dust on the road. It was darker, wetter, like the mud from inside the forest. My stomach dropped. This wasn't the man from the gas station. Or maybe neither of them were. I bolted. I didn't think. I didn't plan. My body just moved, launching me toward the driver's side of my car. I heard him shout something, but I wasn't listening. My fingers fumbled for the handle. I yanked the door open, throwing myself inside and slamming it shut. A fist pounded against the window. I screamed. He was right there, face inches from the glass, his expression unreadable. "You need help," he said again, the words identical to before, the tone unnervingly flat. I twisted the keys in the ignition. The car roared to life. But then, a sound, a low, distorted laughing. Not from the man outside, from the back seat. I turned, my heart slamming against my ribs. And there, a second man, sitting behind me, smiling. His features were twisted into something that almost resembled my own. Not identical, not perfect, just wrong enough. I screamed, throwing the car into drive, tires screeching against the pavement. The figure in the back seat didn't move, didn't breathe. As I swerved onto the road, I risked one final glance in the mirror. Both men, both identical, both impossible, stood motionless in the rearview reflection, watching me, smiling. Then, in a blink, they were gone. The next morning, I didn't stop driving until I saw the first sign of civilization. A diner, its neon lights buzzing against the early morning sky. I stumbled inside, hands shaking, my clothes damp with sweat. The waitress gave me a concerned look as I collapsed into a booth. "You okay, hon?" I tried to answer, tried to find the words. But then I heard it. A voice. Behind me. She needed help. Slowly, dread pooling in my stomach, I turned. A man was sitting at the counter, wearing a flannel jacket, smiling. Story 3. The snow came down heavier than expected. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, peering through the windshield as the wipers smeared slushy streaks across the glass. The highway had emptied an hour ago, and now, the only lights in sight were my own reflecting off the endless white. I should have left earlier. Todd had warned me, told me to wait until morning, but I didn't want to waste a day. My car, a beat-up Hyundai Sonata, wasn't built for this weather. The tires slid slightly every time I hit a curve, forcing me to stay under 40, even as my stomach twisted with unease. The diner was the first sign of life I'd seen in miles. Its neon sign buzzed, half the letters darkened with age, casting a faint glow onto the snowy parking lot. I needed coffee, maybe food, but mostly, I needed to wait out the storm. Inside, the place was nearly empty. A waitress wiped down the counter lazily, and a single man sat at the bar, nursing a beer. That was weird. A beer? At a roadside diner in the middle of a snowstorm? He had the look of someone who didn't belong, like he had been sitting there too long, wearing a dark green coat that looked stiff with old use. His head was slightly turned, like he had been waiting for me to notice him. I tried not to stare. I took a booth by the window, rubbing warmth into my hands. The waitress approached, barely glancing up as she handed me a menu. "Bad night to be driving," she muttered. "Yeah," I said, clearing my throat. "Guess I underestimated the weather." She nodded, and I noticed her glance toward the man at the bar, just a quick flicker of her eyes, but enough to make my skin prickle. I ordered coffee. While I waited, I took out my phone. No service. Figures. Then, where you headed? The voice came from behind me. I turned, and there he was. The man from the bar had swiveled on his stool, watching me with a slight smile. I hesitated. Something about him made my skin crawl, but I forced a polite smile. Upstate, I said vaguely. He nodded. Not a good night for it. I gave a small, non-committal shrug, hoping that would be the end of it. But his smile widened slightly. There's a motel up the road, he said. Cheap. Probably better than freezing to death in that car of yours. I blinked. He had said that like he knew my car was a piece of junk. Like he had seen me struggling on the road. I suddenly felt colder. The waitress returned with my coffee, placing it in front of me with a little too much force. When she turned, I saw it again, another quick flicker of her eyes toward the man. And this time, I caught something else. Fear. My stomach nodded. I glanced back at the man, offering a quick nod before turning back toward my coffee. I wasn't staying here long. The motel. The storm only got worse. After finishing my coffee, I reluctantly decided to take the man's advice. I hadn't planned on stopping, but I wasn't about to slide off the road and die in a ditch. The motel was exactly 5 minutes up the road, just like he said. It was a sad-looking place, just a strip of rooms, their yellow porch lights barely cutting through the snow. The office was a tiny shack, the sign reading vacancy, buzzing faintly in the cold. Inside, an old man sat behind the counter, flipping through a newspaper. He barely looked up as I entered. Room for the night? He grumbled. Yeah, I said, trying not to shiver. Just till morning. He slid a key across the counter. $50. I dug the cash out of my pocket, glancing briefly at the wall behind him. There were no security cameras. No emergency numbers. Just an old clock ticking steadily. Something about that made my skin crawl. I took the key. Outside, the snow had muffled everything, turning the world silent. My boots crunched loudly as I made my way to the room. I paused at the door. There were footprints in the snow, leading to my door. My chest tightened. I turned quickly, scanning the lot, but there was no one else here. Just my car. The prints were fresh. I tried to tell myself it was just from the owner, maybe checking the room before I got here. But when I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the bed was rumpled, not made, like someone had been sitting on it. I stood frozen, my breath sharp in the cold air. The room smelled faintly of something stale. Old dust, old wood. The walls were thin, the heater barely working. I forced myself to step inside, closing the door behind me. I double-checked the lock. Then, for good measure, I slid the chain into place. I should have left. Should have gone back to my car. Should have driven through the damn storm if I had to. But I didn't. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing my hands together, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. Then, a knock at the door. I jumped. It wasn't loud. Just a single, soft tap. I turned my head, staring at the door. Another tap. Then a voice. Low. Familiar. You left your lights on. It was him. The man from the diner. I felt my pulse hammer in my ears. My car was parked right outside the window. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see through the thin motel curtains. And my stomach dropped. My lights weren't on. My car was dark. The snow around it was untouched. My breathing turned shallow. My fingers trembled against my lap. Another tap. You should open up. I stayed perfectly still. Minutes passed. My breath burned in my throat, but I didn't move. Then, the knob twisted. The chain rattled. And then, from the other side, a whisper. You're in the wrong room. The whisper slithered through the crack beneath the door like cold air, sinking into my skin. You're in the wrong room. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The doorknob twisted again, slow, deliberate, testing the lock. The chain rattled slightly, the frail motel door groaning against the pressure. I shot to my feet, stumbling backward. My heel caught on the edge of the cheap motel rug, and I barely caught myself before falling. My pulse pounded in my throat. Then silence. I didn't dare look through the peephole. Instead, I moved as quietly as I could, reaching for my phone on the bedside table. I pressed the screen. No signal. Of course. I turned my attention back to the door, my entire body coiled with tension. Minutes passed. My breath came in shallow gasps, but there was no more movement. No knocking. No whispers. Was he gone? My stomach twisted. I had to check. I crept to the window, my bare feet making no sound against the floor. Gently, I parted the curtain an inch, just enough to see outside. The parking lot was empty. My car. The owner's office. The snow-covered ground. and no one standing outside my door. I exhaled shakily. Maybe he gave up. Maybe he thought I wasn't here. I turned from the window, rubbing my arms against the cold. I just needed to get through the night. In a few hours, the storm would ease up, and I could leave. I sat on the bed, my hands still trembling. The air felt thick, stale. The weight of exhaustion was pressing down on me now, but I knew sleep wasn't an option. Then, something scraped against the wall, right behind the headboard. My heart stopped. The noise came again, a long, dragging scrape, like fingernails against old wood. I shot off the bed, backing toward the bathroom, my mind racing. The sound was coming from inside the wall. I turned toward the mirror above the sink. The reflection was warped, the fluorescent light above flickering slightly. The motel had probably seen decades of neglect. Maybe the walls were just shifting. Maybe it was rodents. Then, another sound. A whisper. Not from the wall. From the vent above the bathroom door. I slowly lifted my gaze. The vent cover was slightly ajar. A small gap, just enough for. Something moved inside. I ran. I didn't think. Didn't breathe. I lunged for my bag, grabbing my car keys in a blind panic. The motel room door was my only way out. I reached for the lock, but the chain was missing. The chain lock was gone. My blood turned to ice. It had been there before. I had locked it. The knob twisted beneath my fingers. Someone was already inside the room. A voice behind me. Going somewhere. I spun around. The man from the diner stood near the bathroom door. But something was wrong. His clothes were the same. His height, his build, everything was identical. But his face wasn't his anymore. It was stretched, slightly distorted, as if the skin was being pulled too tightly over his bones. His mouth was too wide, his lips curling at the edges in a way that shouldn't be possible. And his eyes, they weren't human. Dark, hollow, staring straight through me. My mind barely had time to process before he moved. I threw myself at the door, twisting the knob with everything I had. It flung open, and I ran. The cold night air hit me like a slap. My boots slid on the fresh snow as I sprinted for my car, my fingers trembling so hard I nearly dropped the keys. The lot was still empty. No other cars. No signs of life. Just the whispering wind behind me. I jammed the key into the lock, yanking the door open. I threw myself inside, slamming it shut, my breath ragged as I fumbled to start the engine. Then, a tap on the window. My stomach dropped. I turned my head, heart hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. He was standing right outside my window, smiling. But he wasn't alone. There were two of him. One at my driver's side window. One standing in the middle of the parking lot. Identical. Smiling. Watching me. I gasped, twisting the key. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires spun against the snow, the car fishtailing wildly as I tore out of the lot. In the rearview mirror, they didn't move. They just stood there. Two identical copies of the same impossible man. Watching. Smiling. Then, one of them raised his hand. Not in a wave, but in a gesture. A slow, deliberate beckoning. My vision blurred with terror. I forced my eyes back to the road, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I didn't stop. Didn't look back. I just drove. The next morning, I didn't stop until I saw a gas station hours later. I parked under the bright fluorescent lights, my hands still shaking as I stumbled inside. The clerk gave me a wary look. "You all right?" I opened my mouth to answer, then stopped. The TV behind him was playing a local news report. A headline scrolled across the bottom. "Motel fire leaves no survivors." I stiffened. My stomach dropped. I stepped closer, my breath frozen in my lungs as I took in the grainy footage of firefighters battling the blaze. It was the motel, the exact one I had stayed at. I swallowed hard. When did this happen? The clerk barely glanced up. Last night. Some poor bastard must have fallen asleep with a cigarette. Place went up fast. My fingers went numb. I could still feel the cold wind against my face. The snow beneath my boots. I had just been there. I turned toward the glass doors, my reflection staring back at me. And for a split second, I saw something behind me. Not a person, not a shadow, a face. My own face. Smiling.